Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This government speaks of reform of the police force, reform of frontline services, reform of back office management within the police force. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would suggest that reform is merely a euphemism by which this government is using for some of the most drastic cuts to one of our most vital public services. Actions speak louder than words, and the public will judge this government on their actions and on their decision to cut the police budget by 20%. This government speaks of reform. The reality, it is not reform. The reality is deep and damaging cuts which will drastically affect the front line of our police force. And what's more, the public will form their own opinion in time. We simply cannot underestimate the scale of these cuts. There are almost 250,000 people who are employed by 43 police forces across England and Wales. The Association of Chief Police Officers has put a figure to what the government's 20% cut is likely to translate to in the number of officers on the street. It estimates that 28,000 jobs will be lost as a result of these cuts. Of this, 12,000 will be police officers and 16,000 will be so-called civilian staff. This represents a fall of around 12% in overall staff numbers, 8% of which will be seen in officers losing their jobs. The government's Windsor Review has said that the taxpayer will save £485 million over 3 years as a result of these cuts, but at what cost? Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary has said that more than 2/3 of all the police force staff in England and Wales are employed in frontline roles, but not all of those were necessarily visible. The HMIC said that the front line is not just what you notice, but it's also what you rely on. We must not make a clinical distinction between front and back office and back policing. This is too crude. We must not confuse visibility with deployment. In fact, HMIC has found that 95% of police officers are either on the front line or working in important middle office roles in areas such as intelligence gathering or operational planning. Even if this government's claim that cuts of 20% would only affect back office roles were true, these middle and back office roles are not simply disposable assets that can be thrown away. Cuts to middle and back office roles will inevitably have an effect on the ability of those on the front line to do their jobs. The Prime Minister has said that and I quote, "there is no reason why there should be fewer frontline officers." I would also echo the words of Steve Finnegan, our Chief Police Officer and also the Association of Chief Police Officers Chair. He said that preventing cuts from hitting the front line is going to prove really challenging. In fact, he went further to say that actually it will be impossible to protect the front line. He was asked this week whether because of the government's cuts he would have to reduce frontline policing. He answered, "I absolutely am." Chief Constable Finnegan is also obviously the Association of Chief Police Officers lead officer on performance management. Does the Home Secretary think he's wrong? Does the Home Secretary think the Chief Constable Finnegan of Acton and Lancashire Police is not managing his force correctly? The point is quite simple, and it's something we're hearing from forces across the country. We simply cannot make cuts of 20% without hitting frontline services. Our police force is one of our most vital public services. These officers do some of the hardest jobs in some of the most demanding of circumstances, and this government has wholeheartedly underestimated the commitment and dedication of our police force. This government's so-called reforms will inevitably have an impact upon the police service for years to come. Now, strictly speaking, the government promised that there will be no centrally determined job losses, which I suppose is technically true. Instead, the government is responsible for the heavy front-loaded cuts, leading to inevitable job losses in the hands of local authorities and the police. The priority must be to protect the visibility and availability of police forces in our local communities. But Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents are far from optimistic about these so-called reforms. Lancashire Police Federation has said it, in light of cuts, they will be hit doubly with job losses and cuts to pay, which we've already heard about. I would just like to finish, please, if I may. There's plenty of other speakers who would like to come in. I would like to quote John O'Reilly, Chairman of the Lancashire Police Federation, who said that Lancashire is a top-performing force because of its workforce. John goes on to say that if the government keep bashing us all they are doing is opening the door for criminals to make more to make life more difficult for us. Figures put to the Lancashire Police Authority have suggested a drastic reduction in the number of officers in the force, which will put Lancashire's officer strength at its lowest since 2003. And I think since 2003 in Lancashire, certainly that's been the period of the greatest fall in crime, and I wouldn't like to go back to 2003 crime levels. But the result of these cuts will be an 8-year low in the number of police officers on Lancashire streets. Now, everyone supports sensible reform, but this government is hitting our police forces hard, and it will be to the detriment of our local communities. My constituents are concerned that these cuts to our already stretched police force will be an open invitation for more criminals to commit more crime. Does the government really think that with a police force stretched, understaffed and under-resources, that we will not see crime levels rise? Do they honestly think that antisocial behaviour will not increase and the safety on our streets will be put into question as a result of few officers on the beat? 2/3 of the British public share that concern, and to date the government has done nothing to put these concerns to rest. We are seeing clear concerns that reduced police funding will have detrimental effects, and at the same time the government is prepared to spend £40 million or thereabouts on electing police commissioners. Furthermore, there has now been a 2-year delay on whether the PCSOs will continue, and that is of a great worry to my constituents, worried not only about police cuts but Home Office budgets that will affect PCSOs. This is not just a numbers game. The government seems happy to cut our police force by a fifth, but has it paid any thought to the experience and expertise of these officers that will be lost along with these cuts? The Home Secretary has to realise that you cannot make such drastic cuts of 20% to the police budget without losing some of our most experienced and dedicated officers from the front line. The government has to think again on the scale and pace of these cuts. They are going too far, too fast.